Who, if not the Russians, should know that both the transfer and the production of such weapons is a large-scale process that cannot go unnoticed. Because nuclear weapons are not just a suitcase with a red button, they are a cumbersome system made up of numerous components. And who, if not Russia, knows that both Britain, France, and Ukraine are signatories to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that, unlike Russia, these countries do not violate this treaty. However, the need to have a nuclear deterrent is already being discussed, for example, in Poland and Estonia. And here the question arises, can Ukraine do the same? Serhiy Yaremenko looked into whether it is actually possible to restore the nuclear program.
I am a strong supporter of Poland joining the nuclear project. I mean that the path toward creating a Polish nuclear capability in full compliance with all international norms is the direction we should follow. We are a country located directly on the border of an armed conflict. It is well known what attitude aggressive imperialist Russia has toward Poland.
This statement was made by Polish President Nawrocki on February 15th in an interview with Polsat News, and it caused quite a stir in the Kremlin offices. 3 days later, on February 18th, this stir was further intensified by a statement from Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna, who said that, if necessary, Estonia is ready to host allied nuclear weapons on its territory.
We are not opposed to the deployment of nuclear weapons on our territory. If NATO deems it necessary, according to our defense plans, to deploy, for example, nuclear weapons on our territory as well, then we do not have any doctrine that would prohibit this.
After this, threats from Russia were directed at Estonia, along with harsh statements about the inadmissibility of deploying nuclear weapons on Estonian territory. But let's leave these Moscow ramblings to the specialists in hysteria and turn to this. At a time when Europe is losing the United States as its main security guarantor, and Russian aggression is becoming increasingly threatening, to accuse any country of wanting to protect itself is, at the very least, naive. Discussions about the potential, let me emphasize, potential, revival of Ukraine's nuclear program have been ongoing since the beginning of Russia's full-scale aggression. I am discussing the actual potential of such a revival and how credible Russia's accusations against Ukraine regarding the creation of nuclear weapons really are with Mariana Bujerin, senior researcher at the Nuclear Policy Research Center at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And our conversation about nuclear weapons begins with events from 35 years ago when the Soviet Union collapsed.
Ukraine inherited weapons that had been developed by another country for that country's strategic needs, not for Ukraine. Ukraine came into existence and immediately faced different security challenges than those of the Soviet Union. And accordingly, the weapons, including nuclear ones, if Ukraine had chosen that path, would have had to be different. There are issues of range, issues of delivery systems.
Why are we primarily talking about the time when Ukraine gained independence and had not yet given up its nuclear weapons? Because there is a prevailing opinion that since we already had such a deterrent system, restoring it would be easier than building one from scratch. But to think that way, you have to have a very general understanding of nuclear weapons.
The intercontinental ballistic missiles that Ukraine inherited, there were 176 of them. As people commonly say, that's a heck of a lot. That's a huge number of missiles. Each missile carried several warheads. These missiles have a range of 10 to 15,000 kilometers. Because they are intercontinental, they were designed to keep the United States of America, which is across the continent and the ocean, in their sights.
The technology allows this distance to be reduced by half down to 7,000 kilometers. But considering how Ukraine's allies and enemies have changed in recent years, within a radius of 7,000 kilometers, there is no logical target for these missiles to strike.
7,000 kilometers. What is there to keep in Russia under threat? The Urals. Well, it was necessary to keep some strategic targets in the European part, like Moscow itself or Leningrad itself. That's how deterrence works. You keep them in your sights and say, if you come at us, then we are very much, ready to strike back at you.
Another component of nuclear deterrence is the aviation component, which carries cruise missiles. And such a component would have suited Ukraine very well, if not for one thing. The carriers of these missiles are the Tu-95 and Tu-160 aircraft, which are Russian-made. Building your own military aircraft, well, not every country can do that. It requires both technology and money. Ukraine does not build its own military aircraft, and to depend on someone else in such an important matter means that sooner or later you have to start doing it yourself. And a vivid example of this is the countries of Europe.
We can see now how Europeans are starting to scratch their heads because they bought all these extremely expensive systems, including the F-35 and so on. And if some kind of, these disputes within NATO begin, They really depend on the United States.
And most importantly, Ukraine has never had a full cycle of nuclear fuel production. All of it was concentrated on the territory of Russia.
In Ukraine, what existed was the mining of uranium ore in Zhovty Vody, and there in the Kirovorad region, and the first stage of processing into yellow cake. And they simply remove those rocks that are, well, the adjacent rocks with which it is mined, and extract only this uranium ore.
And even if Ukraine could implement all the previous points, it still would not be able to put them together into a single system. It simply would not be allowed to do so because, let me remind you, our country is a signatory to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons.
It is very difficult to do this in secret because Ukraine has already become transparent in this system. It's integrated into this system. So as soon as any such attempts began, we would be detected very quickly. It would be very difficult for Western countries to continue supporting us, whether during the war or even after the war. There is a high probability that Ukraine could end up under sanctions altogether.
On the other hand, there are examples of India and Pakistan which developed their own nuclear weapons back in the 90s. At that time, part of the world overlooked these developments, and part simply turned a blind eye to them because it was convenient for them then. Later on, certain restrictions were imposed on them, primarily in joint nuclear research. But today, India and Pakistan are not pariah states like, for example, North Korea. India and Pakistan engage in trade, and their representatives meet at global forums. They are not suffering from a multitude of sanctions. But Ukraine is not India, nor is it Pakistan. It's not the 90s anymore, and it seems the world might be willing to turn a blind eye to the lawlessness Russia is committing on our land, but definitely not to any attempts by Ukraine to create its own nuclear weapons. Serhiy Yeremenko, Viktor Dekhtyar, the program Vikna on STB for the United News Marathon.